and white trash talking.
Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, and I'm White Trash Talking. Today, I want to look at a recent announcement by the Trump administration regarding Ukraine that is revealing in terms of the U.S.'s underlying long-term global agenda. Trump campaigned on a promise to end the war in Ukraine in one day. 8 months into Trump's presidency, the war against Russia rages on. Here is Trump giving contradictory signals about wanting the war to end while proudly announcing the shipment of a new weapons system to Ukraine.
We are selling a tremendous amount of equipment to NATO. We're not spending any money, we're making money, but I don't want to talk about making. I want to talk about we're no longer involved with funding Ukraine, but we are involved with trying to stop the war and the killing in Ukraine. So we're selling missiles and military equipment, millions and millions, and ultimately billions of dollars to the NATO people, where I'm very friendly and we have a great relationship. But that was an amazing trip. So they're funding the entire war. We're not funding anything. I think it's an important point to make because a lot of people don't understand that. And we will continue to do that, and we're trying to get as much as we can for them. They want the American product. The American military product is by far the best in the world, and that's what they want to get. They have lots of options, but that's what they want to get. So the factories are doubling up and tripling up where they make the Patriots and other really, you could say, defense and offensive weapons.
This is the new Iran missile that Trump is selling, touted as the U.S. game changer. While at the same time, the Pentagon has announced that they've blocked Ukraine's long-range missile strikes on Russia. Here's Brian Berletic to explain this apparent contradiction.
The United States is performing reconnaissance flights to provide targeting information to Ukraine to carry out long-range strikes with Ukrainian missiles. And so it's just more of this theater. If you saw in the headline of the article talking about blocking Ukraine from using U.S. missiles to strike Russia, it said to get Putin into peace talks or whatever they were calling it. And again, that was just to try to lure Russia in to agree to yet another Minsk-style freeze, and Russia has said no. And so it's a matter of time before the United States reauthorizes strikes on Russia, reauthorizes the use of Western missiles, whatever quantity still exists. And there's these ERAM missiles that are on their way. They're basically glide bombs that have a small jet engine, like a cruise missile, essentially, put on them. They're supposed to be extremely low cost and capable of being manufactured in larger quantities than cruise missiles. And so what are they going to use them to do? They're going to strike targets further behind the line of contact. It's not going to change anything. I think the official number is 3,350. That is what's being sold to Ukraine. They're being manufactured right now. The first 1,000 will reach Ukraine over the course of 2 years. And so it's just a tremendous mismatch. It has been the case in every respect all throughout this conflict, whether you're talking about artillery, rockets, missiles, drones. Russia just has this vastly larger military industrial base, and they're producing more weapons and ammunition than the US and Europe combined. And these are air-launched missiles. So even if they had all 3,350 missiles right now in Ukraine, they only have a handful of military aircraft capable of launching them. They could only launch a certain number of them at a time. This was the same problem they had with other air launch systems like the Storm Shadow and Scalp. They fly a number of aircraft. It's highly risky because Russian warplanes and air defense systems can actually target the aircraft themselves. And they have significant air and missile defense systems that can take out these missiles. You need to launch a huge amount of these missiles just to saturate Russian air and missile defenses, in the hopes that at least some of these missiles get through. And at one point, what Ukraine was doing was striking at civilian targets because they couldn't strike at anything that was actually defended by Russian air and missile defense systems. So it illustrates perfectly the continuity of agenda that exists across U.S. foreign policy. This weapons program actually was announced 2023, 2024, during the Biden administration. And what does President Trump, who said he was going to end the conflict in 24 hours, what does he do? He picks it up right where the Biden administration left off, and he's continuing it. He's seeing it through to the end. The war continues uninterrupted. They're just going to say whatever they need to say to placate the American people. Americans were upset with this war, but now they put a Republican in, and he's going to convince all the Republicans to go along with it. And we've watched this take place. We remember Bush Jr. saying he's going to end all the adventurism abroad, and he started 2 major wars, and he got all the Republicans on board. And then we heard Obama say he's going to end all of Bush's wars, and then he kept all of them going and started new wars. He got all the Democrats who were all anti-war on board with global war, and then Trump, and then Biden, and now Trump again. So it's a very familiar scam, I would say, duping the American people, playing on this left-right political paradigm that does not represent any real divide in America. It's just a means of marketing and selling empire to different target markets.
The U.S. long-term agenda continues unabated, spanning multiple presidencies, immune from any democratic input or oversight. In previous podcasts, Brian Berletic has connected the dots between the U.S.'s proxy war against Russia, the proxy war against Iran and much of the Middle East, and the coming U.S. war against China. Berletic argues that the U.S.'s goal is not necessarily to defeat Russia, although the U.S. wouldn't mind that result, but rather to weaken it enough that it cannot join Iran or China in any axis of resistance. The point of the Russian war is to keep it going as long as possible, right down to the last Ukrainian soldier, if necessary. The U.S.'s two-party system acts as a ratchet that toggles back and forth over time to perpetuate their wars and other policies that are deeply unpopular. It's possible that Trump is not even in charge when it comes to important military matters, but that's probably a topic better suited for another time. Trump's immediate aim is to appease his America First MAGA base, which explains why he insists that he's selling arms to NATO instead of giving them to Ukraine. Trump is implying that these sales are good for the American people, although the truth is that the money will stay in the pockets of the corporate elite. Here's KJ No to discuss this distinction between selling and giving, as well as the role Europe will play in a widening war.
People think that weapons are hardware, but it's not. The modern battlefield is a networked joint operations system that is just completely interconnected. And so in order for a weapons quote unquote kill chain to work, you have the sensors, you have the radar, you have the decision centers, you have all the tactical data networks connecting all of that. And all of that comes as an entire package. So to say, we're selling them as opposed to giving them, that's a distinction without a difference. It's the entire system which is being deployed and used, and that is still under U.S. control. Now, as much as possible, yes, it is true they want to offload the cost to Europe because the U.S. economy is not doing well, and certainly the European economy is not doing well. The Germans have just said, we can no longer afford a welfare state, although they seem to be very certain that they can afford, a 5% military budget. So Europe is being bled dry, and it's being used as cannon fodder against Russia. And the U.S. is sitting back, and they're quite happy to deplete Europe in this fashion, as they did in the previous world wars, where Europe did most of the fighting and the U.S. led from behind and then picked up. And then, lo and behold, it became the global superpower. So there is that calculation going on as well. And also, the idea that essentially, we're hitting a real wall, not simply strategically, but geoeconomically. The capitalist system is essentially in full breakdown. And as I've said before, when you have the system going into cardiac arrest, the wall defibrillator that you use to reanimate the corpse of the capitalist system is war. So we're going into full world war, and the US is happy to profit off of that process, even as it tries to get as much of its work subcontracted and offloaded and offshored, to its vassals. And of course, the vassals are falling for that.
KJ No goes on to point out the root causes of U.S. perpetual war. This is what he said.
They're committed to war. They're committed to hegemony, to U.S. unipolar dominance, and they're, yanking all their Atlanticist ties. Those Atlanticist ties are enduring, and they're foundational to the structure of the ruling imperial elite in Europe and the United States. So they're all singing from the same choir book, working in harmony. Although from time to time, it looks like they're dissenting or trying something different. It's not. It's like the ventriloquist dummy that talks back to the ventriloquist. It looks like like the ventriloquist dummy is arguing, but no, the dummy is still being controlled by the ventriloquist. And so in 2008, the global financial system collapsed around the ears of the ruling imperial elite. And that's when they realized that they needed to take extreme measures. What are those extreme measures? Well, the extreme measure is, as you have monopoly capital, it runs into a crisis, a falling rate of profit, if you will. And then in order to resuscitate itself, it needs to shift and expand. And usually that expansion requires some kind of massive new influx of resources. Ideally, you want to be able to plunder a new continent in order to keep the dead vampire, to feed the dead vampire with new blood. So that is what they are counting on. The Europeans could go two ways. They could go for win-win cooperation with China and the global South and the rising BRICS. They had that choice. Or they can see things in terms of hegemony and unipolar domination, and then they see the world in these win-lose terms, and then it's about waging war and seeing if they can rapaciously destroy China and other countries, and then reinvigorate the capitalist system with fresh blood. And what they've done is they've chosen the latter, primarily because it's part of their indoctrination. They've all been selected to those high positions. They've been groomed for those high positions for decades. That's why they're in those positions to begin with. And then the second thing is really this kind of racist, supremacist notion that, we don't want equals. We'd rather destroy the world than have a world of equals, especially where we are equals with the global South, the people of color, the Chinese, the Asians, etc. We cannot tolerate that. We would rather see the end of the world than the end of our white Western supremacy and privilege and power. And this thinking goes back so deep and so long. It's the reason why, for example, when George Kennan was asked about the long telegram, somebody asked him, we've coexisted with all these other countries. The French and the British have coexisted. Why can't we coexist with Russia? And he hemmed and hawed and gave sociology, psychology, history, etc., etc. And at the end of and then he just kind of boiled it down because he got tired of talking. He said, the fact is the Russians are an Asiatic race, and we cannot have equal relations with them.
I think that KJ No is spot on. When I see the carnage the U.S. has caused in places like Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, Gaza, Ukraine, and so many other countries, it's clear that to the elite, people are just obstacles that stand in their way of dominating and pillaging the world. KJ No is also right about the deep-seated racism. I grew up in the belly of the beast and listened to racist slurs for much of my life. Racism is deeply embedded in the American psyche. George Kennan, whom KJ No referenced, was the principal architect of the Cold War and advocate for containment of the Soviet Union. His view of Russia is fundamentally the U.S. establishment view, which has dictated policy towards Russia for the past 80-plus years. Here's a quote by Keenan that corroborates KJ No's assertion. He says, quote, "From the Russian Asiatic world out of which they had emerged, they carried with them a skepticism as to the possibilities of permanent and peaceful coexistence of rival forces." So there's just something different about the way they think. Okay, here's another quote. He says, quote, "In atmosphere of Oriental secretiveness and conspiracy which pervades this government, possibilities for distorting or poisoning sources and currents of information are infinite. The very disrespect of Russians for objective truth, indeed their disbelief in its existence, leads them to view all stated facts as instruments for furtherance of one ulterior motive or another. There is good reason to suspect that this government is actually a conspiracy within a conspiracy." It's amazing. You know, that they're Oriental, they're Asiatic, they're inherently different, so they think this way. KJ No is right when he said that the U.S. elite will never accept equal relations with Russia, China, and the global South. I believe that World War III is inevitable and that the U.S. will use nukes when confronted by the superior strength of their adversaries. Until then, the U.S.'s two-party deception will continue until the people, tired of being divided and conquered, will rise up and take the reins. That's all I have. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.